Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Rose Canzano. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende Museum. We're back after a few weeks pause with Cold War Spaces. And I'm so happy to welcome our guest today, Guillaume Serina. He's the author of Nuclear-Free Space, Reagan, Gorbachev, and A World Without the Bomb, published in 2019, along with 4 other nonfiction books published in French. He's been a journalist for over 20 years, and he's been a regular US correspondent and contributor for a variety of French and European media outlets. And today he works at the International School LA, where he teaches history. This program today is going to be about a 30-minute conversation between our guest and Joes Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. And after that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box. We appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short and concise so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for other comments and discussion, you can use the chat box, which is open. It's always nice to, if you say hi and what city you're tuning in from. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page afterwards, and also in podcast format on our SoundCloud. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I will hand it off to Joes to get started with the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. And Guillaume, welcome to Cold War Spaces, and especially to this edition, which happens to be the 50th in the series. Very happy to have you here.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to both of you. Thank you to the Wende Museum for the invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Absolutely. So you wrote a book, as Anna Rose mentioned, An Impossible Dream, about the Reykjavik Summit in October 1986, where Reagan and Gorbachev talked about the reduction of nuclear weapons. And American Secretary of State George Shultz, who was also there, called the negotiations a poker game with the highest stakes ever played. And this seems a good way to start our conversation. What do you think of the fact that, according to Schultz, world leaders were playing poker with nuclear weapons?
That's true. And actually, this is almost 1 week apart, 35 years exactly from the summit in Reykjavik.
Right.
That poker game quote from Schultz is always a little troubling to explain. I think it's because at the time in the mid-80s, nuclear weapons were kind of taken for granted. And in the mainstream media or in the population, you know, the mindset was, we have to win or we're going to lose. Mm-hmm. It's almost a game or a war rhetorics that was at the time. And remember, in the mid-80s, when Ronald Reagan is elected for a second term, and when Mikhail Gorbachev comes into power in Soviet Union, the number of nuclear warheads was huge. At the time, you had 69,000 nuclear warheads, all countries, all nuclear powers included. The Soviets had 45,000 nuclear weapons, the Americans 23,000, and then you had the United Kingdom, France, China, and so on. So, you know, in the 80s, World War II was at the same time recent and already, you know, 40 years apart. But I think it was far enough for people to forget the danger and to forget about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at the same time, we're in the midst of that Cold War where we had that huge building in the arms race, which kind of people thought, you know, they're here, these weapons are here, and at some point, it's a game.
Right, right. So I apologize for our viewers for the somewhat shaky internet connection. I hope that stabilizes during the interview, but I think we are okay for now. So let me ask you, you based your book, among other things, on research in archives both in the United States and in Russia. And you also interviewed Gorbachev personally. So was it very difficult to get access to those Russian archives? And how did you manage to speak with Gorbachev?
Well, speaking to him was more difficult than finding the archives. No, the archives are open. So I did my research at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library near Los Angeles in Simi Valley. Everything's accessible for historians. The archivists there are doing an amazing job. As far as the Soviet archives are concerned, I am not a Russophone. I am not speaking and reading Russian, but all of the archives from the time were translated into English, and you can find them at George Washington University. You can find them at the Hoover Institute in Stanford and other sources that were published here and there. So these are not very difficult to access. I had the help of the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow as well, who has obviously some of the documents. Right. Now, being able to interview Gorbachev, that's a different story. It took me a year and a half to get an agreement. I first did a formal request. I didn't have an answer for several months. I kept insisting. I finally got his assistant explaining me it would be a no, mostly because he's declining most of the interviews, that his health, and that was 5 years ago, his health was deteriorating pretty fast. But I kept trying. At some point, I sent a list of all the other people I had interviewed on the Russian side, on the American side, and more. Mm-hmm. And then he said maybe. But basically, I had to go in Moscow in person without a formal agreement. So I flew there, thanks to my publisher, and just rang, my contact there at the foundation, and I was able to meet with him and have a little bit of about 25 minutes one-on-one with Mikhail Gorbachev.
That's great. And apparently he liked the conversation, because he then actually wrote an introduction to your book. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think he liked the fact that I was European. I'm a French originally. I'm also a US citizen, and I live in Los Angeles. But as you can hear, I'm French. And I think he liked the fact that I was not a Russian, not an American, but a European, because most of the literature that's been out about, especially the Reykjavik Summit, is 90% American, with sometimes some bias on there, So I think he was happy about that.
Right. So the summit in Reykjavik is sometimes described as a unique opportunity to get rid of nuclear weapons worldwide. Would you say that's a fair characterization, or, as the title of your book maybe hints at, was it always an impossible dream?
Well, that's a great question. My take on this is that before Reykjavik, we never had a window for such a broad negotiation, and we never had that window open again after. That was a specific time at the end of the Cold War that probably only lasted a few months, where both Gorbachev and Reagan were ready to eliminate, not just reduce, but they talked about eliminating all nuclear weapons from the face of Earth. And that was not possible before Gorbachev's arrival. Under Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernenko, you had a very old, establishment at the head of the Soviet Union. The last direct meeting between the two heads of state were between Carter and Brezhnev in the late 70s. So at the White House, people were very eager to meet this new person, Gorbachev, and actually Ronald Reagan sent his vice president, George H.W. Bush, to Chernenko's funeral, and Gorbachev was in charge of organizing the funeral. And all the Western leaders, Helmut Kohl, Thatcher, Mitterrand, they all went to Moscow at this occasion and met with Gorbachev, and they all came back and said, we can work with this guy. He's different, he's younger, he's only in his mid-50s, and maybe there's a space, he seems different. So that window opened, they first met in Geneva, Reagan and Gorbachev in '85, just to break the ice. they actually said there that a nuclear war should not be risked and cannot be won. So that was a strong statement. But
right.
You had to wait until Reykjavik in October 86 to actually have detailed talks, extremely detailed, and they almost got a deal. But
right. But you could say there was one
didn't make it.
Sorry, yeah. You could say there was one complicating factor there, and that is that one of the reasons maybe the Cold War stayed relatively cold, was the principle of mutual assured destruction. When one country would attack the other country would counterattack, and then both countries would be gone. But there was at least a perspective to change that with the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, or Star Wars as it's called, under Reagan, which at least suggested that there was a technical possibility to stop a nuclear attack. And that, of course, would dramatically change the whole power dynamic and would theoretically at least make it possible to think of starting a nuclear Cold War as a strategic advantage. How did this discussion about SDI play into the conversations in Reykjavik?
It's indeed the main point. That's the heart point of the discussions. So SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, was announced by Reagan in 1983, 3 years before the Reykjavik Summit, to the surprise of most of of the Republican Party, to the surprise even of American scientists, who said immediately after, you cannot do that. This is, putting weapons into space, and we don't want to get there. That's too dangerous. So it was interesting to see in the documents the reaction of the scientific community in the United States. They were quite very much opposed to it. So the principle of SDI, for those who are not aware of it, was basically to send satellites in orbit armed with lasers. There were different technologies discussed, but basically the one that was discussed the most was to equip these satellites, like a belt of satellites around the globe, with lasers. And the idea would be to shoot down an intercontinental missile, let's say launched from the Soviet Union, in its 25 minutes flight before it would reach the ground. Obviously, this was not technically possible at the time. It is still not possible today. Having talking to many experts about it in my research, it was not possible financially. This would have cost trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, not just to launch and equip a few satellites, but think of the maintenance of, if something goes wrong, to send someone or to have computers program. We're in the 80s, we're not in the 2020s, right. To maintain that system in place. So, the irony of this is that it's the reason why we didn't have a deal in Reykjavik, and we can explain that a little later, but it was based on some kind of political fantasy and not on a scientific, scientifically proved possibility. Yeah. And that's the sadness of it.
Right. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the consequences, because it's mentioned that Reykjavik was this unique opportunity to reach an agreement, but in the end, both parties left Reykjavik disillusioned and somewhat frustrated. So, let me put it bluntly, what party was to blame in this case, or were both parties to blame? How do you see that? Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating to read the memorandum of conversations that I quote in the book at length. What happened there was two very strong personalities meeting, appreciating each other. There was respect. The meeting in Geneva the prior year went well. I would say they quite liked each other. I think these two people, grew up in the countryside, in poverty, and I think that, unconsciously, subconsciously, it kind of linked them. They did hate nuclear weapons, and there's proof of that from way back before they were in power. But so Gorbachev comes to Reykjavik with the fear of SDI. And his nuclear advisor, Ronald, told me when I interviewed him, the Americans oversold Star Wars and the Soviets overbought it. And that's what happened. So right. Gorbachev arrives basically with a carte blanche from the Politburo saying you can go as far as you want. And the documents prove that in terms of eliminating nuclear weapons, category by category, maybe even the whole range. Yeah. The Americans, they come prepared, but they were ready to talk about other topics than arms control. They were getting ready to talk about human rights, to talk about Afghanistan, to talk about other hotspots, of the Cold War in Africa or Latin America. And they were quite actually surprised that Gorbachev and his team were just dead on wanting to talk a reduction of nuclear weapons. And right. One thing that explains that is that this Reykjavik Summit was planned in a hurry. It wasn't a planned summit. It wasn't an official head of state visit. It happened right after the Chernobyl accident.
Yeah, right.
And Gorbachev, a few months after Chernobyl, decides to write a letter to Reagan, that's in July 1986, where he's asking for intermediate summit. They thought going to London, then they decided to go to Iceland, which is middle ground, middle ground diplomatically, but also geographically, where they could meet. And Gorbachev just goes there with that will to propose a very, very broad deal. And what happened, especially on the second day of the talks, is that they quite quickly arranged a meeting, an agreement about intermediate range missiles. And that led to the INF Treaty in 1987. So that was a success. Right. But on the second day, on the Sunday, they want to go further, the Russians. And they do start to talk about eliminating all nuclear weapons in a time frame of 10 years. And the proposition was that in the meantime, the Americans were allowed to research and develop SDI in a laboratory for that time of 10 years. And during that time of 10 years, they would trust and verify, according to the Ronald Reagan motto, meaning the Russians would send their experts in the US and the reciprocity would be true to make sure the nuclear weapons were dismantled. And then it becomes very dramatic in that room. There's a lot of emotion. They have tears in their eyes. They yell at each other. And George Shultz intervenes, Secretary of State, and says, Mr. President, to Ronald Reagan, don't you want to think about that? This is a historic opportunity. Mm-hmm. And Eduard Shevardnadze, which was the Foreign Affairs Soviet minister, says, let's think of our children and grandchildren here. We have right now the only window to strike that deal. Yeah. And on the other hand, on the American side, you had people from the Pentagon, especially John Poindexter, who was the National Security Advisor, representing Weinberger, the Defense Secretary in Reykjavik, who was not in favor of a deal. So you find Ronald Reagan tired, much older, on that Sunday afternoon, deciding not to want a third day of negotiation. It was proposed by the Soviets and by his team to stay overnight. Reagan says he wants to go back to Washington to be with his wife, Nancy, and they decided to fly without a deal. And right. There's this dramatic scene where Gorbachev walks Reagan to his car in front of that house in Reykjavik and says, Mr. President, if you want to go back immediately, I'm ready. Let's do this again.
Yeah.
And Reagan slams the door and just leaves. So it's pretty dramatic what happened there.
Right. So 2 days after the summit, Gorbachev gave a summary of what happened for the Politburo in Russia. And you have a very nice quote in your book, which I would like to read. He says, "Why have we failed to reach an agreement? This can be explained by a lot of objective and subjective factors. As far as Reagan was concerned, we had to battle in Reykjavik, not only our leading enemy, but also a representative of our enemy who expressed many primitive, even caveman-like attitudes and a certain intellectual incapacity." Well, those are pretty harsh words, especially when you mentioned that earlier in Geneva, they seem to like each other. Do you think that this was Gorbachev's strategy to explain what happened in Reykjavik, or was that at that moment what he really felt about Ronald Reagan?
Maybe he felt that's hard to say, but right after the summit, we're in that frame where propaganda and communication, needs to be won. And since his even press conference in Reykjavik, the same day, Gorbachev kept hammering Reagan, saying, he's responsible for the failure of that. And actually, the Americans really struggled. There's this amazing moment in Air Force One on the way back from Reykjavik, where Poindexter talks on and off the record to the American reporters there. You have everybody from the New York Times, CBS News, and so on. And because the press didn't know what they were talking about, Poindexter reveals what happens, and the American press can't believe their eyes. They are telling him, "Are you saying you were about to eliminate all nuclear weapons and you didn't take the deal?" Mm-hmm. And so there was an embarrassment. Actually, the press, American press, was really tough on Reagan after that. This is, by the way, the cover story of Time magazine right after the summit. The press was tough. The Reagan administration definitely lost that communication battle, and 2 weeks later they even lost the midterms elections. So that was it. So that was definitely a strategy from Gorbachev to hammer that.
Right. So after Reagan was no longer president, a series of negotiations have happened, the START negotiations, and according to the START 4 agreement, both countries agreed to limit the number of nuclear weapons to 1,500 each, which of course is still more than enough to completely destroy the Earth. Would you think, looking back, that a world without nuclear weapons, or a negotiation about a world without nuclear weapons, would have made the world a safer place? Or is it maybe even the other way around, because we don't have war due to nuclear weapons? What do you think?
Reducing the number is key. It will definitely make the planet safer. Indeed, there were several START treaty after Reykjavik, and right now we're in New START or START 4, as you said. Well, currently, right now in 2021, just found the most recent numbers here. We still have 13,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Russians have 6,255, the Americans 5,500. And then all the other countries, plus the countries that host nuclear weapons within the NATO alliance, like Italy or Belgium and so on. So definitely, I think reducing them to even much more than what we have now would make the world safer. We went that close at least 50 times of a nuclear bomb exploding, whether by accident, whether by terrorism, stealing some, and we have documented proof of that, many incidents in the US. There's great stories you can find everywhere. I know we're running out of time, but there's amazing stories. We now know it's documented that Osama bin Laden before 9/11 in the late 90s did spend $1 million or more, I don't remember exactly, to buy enriched uranium from some Pakistanis, but it wasn't enriched enough to make a nuclear weapon. So we do have proof of all of that.
Yeah.
So definitely using the frame we saw, the diplomatic frame we saw in Reykjavik, but much more recently, we could use, the example of the climate Paris Agreement, where that took 10 years in the making with all the countries in the world sitting down because we're all facing the same threat. As you might know, in 2017, the United Nations passed a treaty that bans nuclear weapons, and that treaty went into force this year in January 2021. We have 86 countries that signed that treaty, 56 of them ratified, which allowed the implementation of it. So there, we do have tools. International laws now exist, so that gives us, I think, a good frame to work on something like that.
Thank you. We are almost going to switch to Q&A, and please, if you have any questions, put them under the Q&A box where I will read them. But before we go there, I want to ask you about the current situation. So there is an ongoing threat, of course, of terrorist organizations obtaining nuclear weapons, or at least the technology. You can think of undemocratic countries starting a nuclear war, or you can think of democratic countries with an undemocratic president starting a war at some point. What are the mechanisms that can make us feel a little bit safe, or is it just a world about to explode? What is your assessment?
Well, yeah, this is a very current question, and everyone interested in that point should read the new Robert Costa Bob Woodward book. The prologue is exactly about that. The prologue takes place during the Trump-Biden transition, and it tells how the Chinese were extremely scared that the US would launch an attack on them to kind of, after January 6th and the assault on the Capitol, to try to basically stay in power. It's very well documented, and the main topic, and I know it's very much discussed in all the nuclear weapons expert world, is that having only one person decide the use of nuclear weapons, that's a problem. It's not just the case in the United States, it's the case, of course, for Russia, China, and even France. So we should find some kind of mechanism, architecture, where it's not just the power or the will of one person, and that person might well be an autocrat, even in a democratic country, like you said, to basically, launch the codes. And so that's a debate I think that we should have in a democracy. In the next presidential campaign, for example, I always complain that the question of nuclear weapons is never being asked to the candidates. Even the budget of it, it's 15 billion every year, to maintain. And that's just in France. So it's much more in the United States. I can't even remember the number right now. But every year, tens of billions of dollars are used just to maintain that deterrence idea, which is obviously very dangerous, because we're all humans, and mistakes are possible.
Right. Thank you. So we have a question here from Michelle Willens, and she asks, I was in Moscow at the Gorbachev Foundation a few years back. He does not seem very popular these days. That the union fell apart because of him. What do you think his reputation is?
That's true. Good question. And I think you're right. He's not a popular figure in Russia. he's seen as the one who buried the Soviet Union. In the Western world, though, here and in Europe, he's seen as a hero who, avoided a bloodbath when the Berlin Wall fell. And, in one phone call, you could have decided, ordered to shoot on the crowd, for example, and didn't do that. So he's seen in the world as a heroic figure, but it's true that in Moscow, he's not popular. I know he doesn't have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. They fought on Crimea, for example, and other topics publicly. So yeah, that's the case.
Yeah, although a few weeks ago I read that a new play opened in Moscow about Gorbachev and Raisa, his wife, in which they are portrayed in a very positive way, and Gorbachev actually went to the premiere, and it seems to be very successful.
Very nice.
So that's good news. Yeah. So while we have at this moment no other questions, let me ask you. You mentioned also in your book that Ronald Reagan already in 1976 expressed himself in favor of a world without nuclear weapons, which makes it maybe a little bit surprising that he refused to continue the talks in Reykjavik. In how far would you describe Reagan as a utopian thinker?
That's a great question. And I don't have an answer to that. It is true that his dislike of nuclear weapons is well documented, and way before he was president. Even as a governor of California, he expressed himself about them. And indeed, in 1976 at the Republican convention, which he lost it was very close to Gerald Ford, to be the party nominee. He does that improvised speech on stage where he goes about a time capsule and he says, well, I was asked recently by a reporter, what if I had a time capsule, 40 years from now? And he says, I want to see a world without nuclear weapons.
Right.
But right now it's a defeated Reagan that speaks. He has no clue about his own future. At that point, he doesn't know if he can come back in 1980 and be the nominee for the Republican Party. Right. So it seems sincere because he expressed it so many times over time. But in Reykjavik, you have there a much older president that's taken by his team, who's basically in two camps. He has, if I summarize, the diplomats who want to reach a deal with the Soviets, and he has the military who doesn't want that, who tells them that's a trap, you can't trust these people. And at the end of the day, he decides not to go the diplomatic way and not to make a deal. And some of the advisors I interviewed still don't know exactly what triggered that decision. They obviously think it was the right decision. Still today, they say that's where we won the Cold War, which is a nice way to rewrite what really happens. But the fact is, it didn't go all the way. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Another point I wanted to ask you about is the meltdown of the reactor number 4 in Chernobyl. You mentioned it already, but in how far would you think did this occurrence inspire Gorbachev to be more radical in his thinking of the elimination of nuclear weapons? What was that a key moment for him that's made him realize the real danger of those weapons?
Yes, definitely. Definitely, it's a turning point. It's a turning point. Again, after the summit in Geneva, they had agreed to meet again at some point later, whether in the Soviet Union or in the United States, but more towards the year 1987. So Chernobyl triggers Gorbachev to write that letter to Reagan to ask for another summit before, almost an urgent summit. And actually what decides Gorbachev to write that letter was two people visiting him in Russia. François Mitterrand visited him, and they extensively talked about Ronald Reagan and his state of mind. And Richard Nixon, the former president, him a visit at about the same time, late spring, early summer, 86. And both of these people convinced him to, I think, use Chernobyl, or at least to go back to Reagan saying we need to meet again. So Chernobyl was definitely a key turning point. And that's why we have a very almost unprepared summit in Reykjavik. It was fantastic to see all the preparation documents. Basically, they only had 2 months to get ready in terms of logistics, for example, you know, where do the delegations sleep, you know, who arrives first, who welcomes whom, but also, do we invite the press or not? And of course, what are we going to talk about? And I already mentioned that both camps didn't prepare the same way.
Right. Why did they pick Reykjavik as a place to meet?
Yes, correct.
No, sorry, that was a question. Why did they pick Reykjavik as a place where they would convene? No, it's fine. Yeah.
Yes, well, they picked Reykjavik, who was, you know, Iceland was not a key player at all in international relations at the time. They first mentioned London, and then they decided that it was, you know, obviously too much of a key player in that field, you know, that the relationship between Great Britain and the US were too strong. It was not a neutral ground enough. So they went to, they decided to Reykjavik, mostly for also geographical reason. It's almost right in the middle in terms of number of hours of flight. You know, they would go through, from Moscow, they would, you know, really go around the North Pole. So it's shorter. So it was both saying couldn't go to a NATO ally like the United Kingdom. You needed a neutral ground and somewhere close for both of them.
Yeah. And of course, Reykjavik in 1972 was also the place where one of the climactic sports events of the Cold War took place, the chess world championship match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky.
That's right.
There are 2 other questions. Christian Rigby asked, did Reagan ever comment on not doing more after he was out of power?
Do you mind to repeat that?
Yeah, so
a little bit.
Did Ronald Reagan ever comment on, I guess, himself or the United States not doing more after he was out of power? So did he regret not going further than he did?
He doesn't regret at all what happened in Reykjavik. He said, at least publicly, that he was convinced that was the right decision for the United States. He kept saying he made that promise to the American people to carry on with SDI. He kept saying it was a defensive system and not an offensive system, which obviously was not bought by the Russians, saying, well, you know, if it's defensive, it can as well be offensive. You know, the weapon is a weapon. So, but Ronald Reagan kept that line all the way till the end, saying that was the right thing. We still had the INF treaty, and then it led to the START treaty. So it was a good thing. Gorbachev still sees it as a positive summit today. He says, you know, it was really the beginning of arms reduction, you know, and we went as far as we could. Yeah. Of course, he regrets it failed for the bigger deal, but they see that as a positive thing too.
In spite of talking to a caveman.
Yes.
Okay, right. We have a very interesting question here from William Kuhl, and he writes, there are stories and claims by Russia and other powers of the development of hypersonic nuclear weapons that would radically shorten the time from launch to detonation, and thus the response time to verify the accuracy of launches and consider options. Do you have any insights to this development?
Great question. That's the current question in the field. I don't have more insight information except what I see in the press. And it's almost every day these days, you know, hypersonic missiles is definitely not just the future, but is already a current present truth. The Americans have some, even, you know, the Chinese and the Russians, and North Korea just launched a few days ago, apparently a hypersonic missile from a submarine. Mm-hmm. And France did some tests last summer or 2 summers ago in the Atlantic Ocean. So it's very much a reality. We are very much in a new arms race. I don't like when we say, oh, it's a new Cold War. It's a little more complicated than that. It's always tricky to compare different periods of time. But there is definitely a new arms race. On the American side, you know, Barack Obama, right before leaving office, did agree to new nuclear weapons. That was carried on by President Trump and is now being carried on by President Biden. In response, officially, to the Russian threats and to the Chinese threats. So this is definitely something we should worry about. When you see what's going on in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, that's definitely what people are talking about right now. Yeah.
Right. All right, Guillaume, I want to thank you very, very much for this very informative and interesting presentation. It was great to have you. Thank you so much. Sure. And yeah, I also want to mention that our next Cold War Spaces interview is in 2 weeks from now, Wednesday, November 3rd, same time. And my guest will be Kathleen Reinhardt, Curator of Contemporary Art at the Albertina Museum in Dresden. And we will speak about the very politicized debates about exhibiting East German art in reunified Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it would be great to see you there. And thank you so much for watching.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.